Okay, so welcome everybody to the first session of Marx's Capital in the 21st Century. In the seminar, we'll zoom out to cover the core themes of Capital Volume 1, taking 2 of the 8 sections per session. Instead of getting lost in what can become a sort of secular socialist equivalent of scriptural exegesis, we think hard, with care, and analytical rigor about Marx's core arguments in each of the 8 sessions. Your instructor is Ben Burgis, an American socialist political commentator, author, and adjunct philosophy professor at Rutgers University. He graduated from Aquinas College in Grand Rapids in 2003, obtained an MA in philosophy from Western Michigan University, and a PhD at the University of Miami. So take it away, Ben.
All right. Thank you so much for that, and I am really excited about this class. Since we're about to do a lightning tour of this absolute doorstopper of a book, I thought that it might be fun to ease into it by looking at something that Marx wrote that was a whole lot shorter. In fact, is only a single page long. In 1865, he typed out he filled out a confession. Marxist.org, which is where I'm taking this from, describes these confessions as semi-jocular questionnaires that I suppose were the approximate Victorian equivalent of like a late 20th century quiz in a glossy magazine, or I guess maybe a very early 21st century Facebook quiz. And yes, I know that even that reference makes me feel very old. And, it would ask you about your favorite color, your favorite food, stuff like that. Some of the answers are extremely predictable. His favorite color, for example, is red. His favorite names are Jenny and Laura, not coincidentally the names of his wife and daughter. A couple of the answers read as sort of, playfully sexist, maybe in an attempt to needle Jenny. Some of them aren't super interesting. His favorite food is fish. He left the line for figure in history you dislike the most blank. My best guess is that he had trouble narrowing down the list. On the line for your hero, though, he listed 2 names instead of 1. So the heroes he listed are Johannes Kepler and Spartacus. And I really think that those 2 selections combine to tell us everything about how Marx conceived of the intellectual project that he would have been knee-deep in at this point in the final stages of getting Capital done and ready for publication. Kepler took the study of the heavens, which people had previously thought of as a kind of, just a different sphere of reality, and assimilated it into mundane physics by discovering laws of planetary motion. And Spartacus, of course, led a slave revolt. It's right at the overlap between those 2 projects that we can see what Marx takes himself to be up to in Capital. He's trying to figure out the laws of motion of capitalist economies. That's the scientific part of scientific socialism. But of course, this is an applied science. It's not just knowledge for the sake of knowledge. The point of the intellectual labor in Capital is to serve the political cause of overcoming capitalism. Okay, before we get to that, I have been told that we should save student introductions for the second session, since the new center posts this first one publicly and new people might join, which is also why this is going to be like kind of very traditional sort of 3/5 lecture and, an hour of discussion, whereas we can find ways to make the remaining sessions a bit more participatory. But I guess it can't hurt to spend just a minute at the beginning of the lecture today on my own background with this book and what I've been up to for the last few years. So first, right, to be upfront about the bad news about my academic background and training, I am not an economist. I am also not a German scholar. I took a few years of German in school a very long time ago, and If you drop me in Berlin today, I could probably fumble my way through ordering coffee and asking for directions, but I'm certainly not here to, make authoritative statements about fine-grained word-for-word translation choices. Um, More on that point later, but for now, let me just say something about what I do think I can bring to this. My academic background is in analytic philosophy, which basically means being trained in how to take apart arguments and put them back together again, and can very carefully tease out and disambiguate slightly different ideas, how to make objections, respond to objections, and see where there might be a third option between the other two, and all of that. And all of that is the kind of thing that I'm trying to apply to Marx's arguments in Capital when I do these classes. This is the fifth Capital class that I've done in the last few years, counting one that's still ongoing on the Patreon and probably will be for quite some time. For the first three, two Zoom ones and one in person in Los Angeles, we went through this thing about a chapter a week. Sometimes we doubled up for very short chapters, and sometimes we broke up some of the most massive ones. But pretty much for all three of those classes, we did a chapter a week. The one that's still ongoing is ongoing because we slowed it way, way down. Like we've, been at it for like a year, and we're about a third of the way through volume one. Everybody who signed up to that class is comfortable being in it for the long haul. So the other half of what I think I can offer here is just that I have spent a pretty ridiculous percentage of my time and energy in the last few years thinking about this book, which is probably obvious every time I hold it up because it has seen better days. Of course, lots of people who have readings of this that I completely disagree with have spent at least as much time or more time, right? Thinking about it and, rereading it and all of that stuff, which sadly does mean that you can't just take my word for any of this stuff. You should, think about what I say and read those other guys and think about what they say and, come to your own conclusions. But I do think that contemporary Marxology, whatever its other virtues, tends to suffer from a severe deficit of that kind of characteristic analytic philosophy emphasis on clarity and precision and taking arguments apart. So whether or not you necessarily think I'm right in any of the stuff I'm going to be arguing in these lectures, maybe this is at least a perspective that should be somewhere in the mix, along with close readings of Capital that come out of very different traditions. And speaking of close readings, that's pretty clearly not what we're doing in this particular seminar. Um, it's exactly what we're doing in that ongoing Patreon class, but it's not what we're doing here in the New Center class, where we're doing, this entire thing over the course of 4 weeks. So before we get into the meat of this for today, let me just say one quick word about why I thought that this kind of galloping through it at 2 of the 8 sections a week would be a useful and interesting way of going over the book in this class. Because this thing is full of wonderful turns of phrase, of course. Marx is one of the great nonfiction prose stylists of the 19th century. And even at his driest and most technical, he'll still say like really fascinatingly suggestive things that make it very tempting to zoom in on them until you've maybe not only missed the forest for the trees, but you're like lovingly examining every individual leaf on every one of those trees. And look, I obviously think there are real insights to be gleaned from going through the book leaf by leaf, or I wouldn't be doing the 3-year version of the class too. But when the New Center asked if I wanted to propose a 4-week seminar on something, I thought, hey, this would be a great chance to actually kind of take a look comprehensively at the forest, the shape of the forest, right? So taking the 8 sections of Capital and covering 2 of them at a time is a chance to think in a really big picture way about, for example, in today's class, what's the main argument that Marx is making in part 1 on money and commodities, and how does that relate to the main argument that Marx is making in part 2, right, on the transformation of money into capital. And taken together, how does what he's saying in these two sections set up what he's going to be doing in parts 3 through 8? And as the title of the seminar suggests, I'm particularly interested in thinking about all of this, not just from the perspective of like a historian of ideas with no agenda beyond satisfying his or her intellectual curiosity, but with an eye on how this book can provide useful and relevant insights for intellectually arming the socialist project as we're all trying to pursue it more than, a century and a half after this thing was published in a radically altered intellectual and political environment. Um, what do I mean by that? I'll just run through three quick examples. The first one is one that we're going to get back to in a big way by the end of today. And the other two are definitely checks that we'll try to cash by the end of the seminar in a few weeks. So first, one big shift in that intellectual terrain is that when Marx is writing about the labor time values of commodities and the long-term relationship between those values and actual market prices, he's basically speaking the same language as bourgeois economists like Adam Smith and David Ricardo. I'm not claiming that what he's saying about these things is exactly the same, but there is a certain kind of terrain of shared assumptions going on there. He's criticizing parts of what they say about these subjects, but there are, again, substantially shared premises. But of course, economics hasn't stayed still for the last 16, or I guess actually almost 17 decades. Bourgeois economists today are more likely to be marginalists about value. And even when we look at the tiny bit interesting subset of academically trained economists who are otherwise deeply committed, deeply sympathetic to Marxist insights and deeply committed to the socialist project, people like John Romer or people like my friend and Blueprint co-author Mike Beggs, a lot of those guys are pretty skeptical of some of Marx's empirical premises about price, value, and the relationship between the two. So when we're thinking about the argument about labor exploitation and capital, and the core of that argument is what you've already got in the last part of what you read for today. Although, of course, he's going to be adding a lot of depth and complexity to it, even in the sections we're reading for next week. An important issue to think about as you go through all this is how much of this does or doesn't rest on premises that even the Beggses and the Romers of the world are skeptical about in 2026. And so, as most of us as non, people who are not academically trained economists, that might at least give us pause about who's right about those premises. And I want to emphasize that this is not just an interpretive issue, it's a conceptual one. In other words, it's not just a matter of does Marx believe X and does Marx believe Y? It's a matter of does his argument for X go through when we subtract premise, so does this argument for Y go through when we subtract premise X? What's the conceptual relationship between the two? Okay, second example of what it means to read Marx's Capital sort of through this kind of 21st century lens. Famously, in the postface to the second edition of this, which some of you may have read, so I asked you to read the first two parts, but if you already also read the prefaces and all that, the Penguin edition, which is the one that everybody should be reading if you're reading in English, that includes the postface to the second edition, sort of in the part where they have the prefaces. So in that postface, Marx famously declines to write what he calls recipes for the cookshops of the future. If you read the Princeton translation, that says eateries of the future for some reason, which gosh, I really think is a crime against the literary value of this book, but that's neither here nor there. But the basic idea in that passage seems to be that as Marx diagnoses capitalism's internal laws of motion and the dynamics that he thinks will one day allow it to be overthrown and replaced with socialism, he doesn't feel any need to sit around producing blueprints for what could come next. Perhaps he thinks that the victorious workers' movement, facing challenges and complications that no socialist intellectual writing in advance of the event itself could possibly predict, um, will, organically come up with answers to those challenges based on democratic deliberation, and trying to anticipate it all would be a bit arrogant. He doesn't see much point. If so, if that is what he's saying, I would argue that whatever can be said for this attitude in 1867, it becomes basically indefensible by 2026, given the economic dysfunctionality of the state socialist experiments that played out in the 20th century. If you want to convince people to give it another go, that a new form of socialism will be economically viable in ways that the old one wasn't, you probably do owe it to them to give them some recipes with enough detail that they'll be convinced that when they do get to the cook shops of the future, they'll at least have something to eat. And when we try to think that through, a lot of socialists in the 21st century who basically buy most of the rest of what Marx says in this book have become convinced that even if we expropriate the entire capitalist class and we extend democracy into the workplace and socialize investment, we will probably need to retain some market mechanisms as a tool of economic coordination between worker-owned units of production. Right? What was called the socialist calculation debate between socialist and anti-socialist economists in the 20th century convinced a lot of socialists of that conclusion. And of course, even more were convinced through the demonstration in practice with the problems of Soviet-style planning. And even though Marx isn't pausing to give any fully worked out recipes, right? He's true to his word in the postface. The few glimpses that Marx does give us in here of what he thinks the cook shops of the future might look like seem to be very robustly marketless. You get a couple of flashes in the reading for today. There's one in the section on commodity fetishism at the end of chapter 1, and another in the footnote on Owen at the beginning of chapter 3. And at least judging by those flashes and what you get later in the book and elsewhere, critique of the Goth program, all of that, it really does seem like Marx is imagining a totally marketless post-capitalism to the extent that he's, sort of taking the time to imagine anything. So an important question to think about is, does Marx just think that full planning would be normatively preferable to market socialism? Which would be compatible with thinking that, okay, now that we've absorbed the, lessons of the calculation debate and, some of the 20th century socialist experiments, we know that, okay, for now, some sort of scheme of, market socialism might be the best we can do. Or does his analysis of capitalism in this book, as some Marxologists maintain, entail that any sufficiently widespread form of commodity production would count as a kind of crypto capitalism, right? Even if there were worker-owned units of production and all investment was run through the public sector and, all of that. That is a huge question. And some of what we'll say today is going to be relevant to answering it, but I'm certainly not going to try to tackle it in today's class. But it is something I want to think about for the remaining few classes. Finally, when we're thinking about capital in the 20th century, an important issue to think about has to do with a challenge that you often hear from anti-Marxists. Although the form of the point I thought it might be fun to look at is one that was made in a very different context by one of the most important, Marxists of the 20th century, Leon Trotsky. In 1939, Trotsky was in the middle of a faction fight with some of his North American followers, and a lot of different political and philosophical issues kind of got mixed up together in that debate, ranging from the class nature of the USSR to whether, the dialectical method was really central to Marxism in the way that Trotsky thought it was. So he wrote this famous essay called The ABCs of Materialist Dialectics. I disagree with a lot of what he says there, just for fun. Anyone who wants to see why I disagree with a lot of that essay should check out the Trotsky chapter of my book, Give Them an Argument. But the first part of this screenshot is interesting. In contrasting the virtues of what he's calling dialectical thinking to the vices of vulgar thinking, Trotsky says that, quote, vulgar thought operates with such conceptions as capitalism, morals, freedom, workers' state, etc., as fixed abstractions, presuming that capitalism is equal to capitalism, morals are equal to morals, etc. In other words, that there's a fixed, unchanging essence that all examples of this embody. Capitalism is capitalism is capitalism. By contrast, dialectical thinking, he writes, analyzes all things and phenomena in their continuous change while determining in the material conditions of those changes that critical limit beyond which A ceases to be a worker state ceases to be a worker state. The fundamental flaw of vulgar thought lies in the fact that it wishes to content itself with motionless imprints of a reality which consists of eternal motion. Dialectical thinking gives to concepts, by means of closer approximations, corrections, concretization, a richness of content and a flexibility. I would even say a succulence, which to a certain extent brings them closer to living phenomena. All right, who doesn't like succulence? And then there's the part that I highlighted here, where he says not capitalism in general, but a given capitalism at a given stage of development. And in context, what Trotsky is building up to is the part after the highlight, since that's what's relevant to his argument about the Soviet Union with, that he was having with his factual opponents in that debate. But I want to pause on that highlighted sentence. Not capitalism in general, but a given capitalism at a given stage of development. Because, of course, while Trotsky's intention is not to tell anyone that Marx's capital is outdated, I mean, he would never. If you think he's right about the dangers of seeing capitalism as a static, settled thing, you might start to worry that reading about a form of capitalism that, is more than a century and a half old, right? The capitalism of child labor and steam engines in 1867, where, joint stock companies, still only made up a relatively modest portion of the economy. And thinking that the insights that you glean from, somebody who's examining that form of capitalism are going to be applicable to the capitalism of, AI data centers and Starlink and rampant financialization, you might worry that that's going to make you guilty of the very thing that Trotsky says dialectical thinking is supposed to immunize us from doing, thinking that capitalism is capitalism is capitalism. Hell, some people, who see themselves as working, in the Marxist tradition, argue that we aren't even living in capitalism, in 2026. People like Yanis Varoufakis and Jody Dean argue that we're either already living in or we're at least at some stage of a transition into an entirely new mode of production called techno-feudalism. For the record, I do not agree with them, but it is a challenge that has to be taken seriously. So the third example of how we're interested in thinking about, Marx's capital through the concerns of the 21st century is that we want to think through the question of how much of Marx's analysis is specific to the capitalism of his era and how to think about how to translate it to thinking about the capitalism of ours. Okay, enough about the complications that arise when we're trying to apply the insights of this book to our century. Let's talk about the book itself. First, I want to just throw down a few markers on very basic principles that should inform how we're reading it and understanding it. First, we should treat Marx like any other historical thinker. He was certainly a world historic genius, but he was not always right. He was working with the information that he had and sort of reasoning things through the best way that he could. And we should keep an eye out for cases where he took some premises for granted that might not, Maybe they don't hold up. Maybe, some of these premises might seem dubious from our hindsight. And if so, we then have to think hard about whether there's a way to reconstruct his argument without that premise, or whether that particular argument is one that we have to leave behind. Second, I cannot emphasize enough that capital is not a puzzle box. Marx wasn't leaving some elaborate trail of breadcrumbs through the subtle shades of his German word choices that would lead only the cleverest and most, dedicated interpreters to his true hidden meaning. He was writing with the intention that radicalized working class autodidacts, if they were literate and had the patience to stick at all 33 chapters, would understand him perfectly well. And these aren't crazy expectations, given that, while of course the vast majority of 19th century workers were not literate, the ones who were literate were like insanely well read by our standards, right? They didn't have TV, never mind scrolling technology. And for the same reason, you could generally expect a lot more readerly patience. In fact, he also expected that radicalized working class autodidacts who didn't speak German would be able to understand him perfectly well. William Clare Roberts actually points this out in his essay that's included in the Princeton edition of Capital. If you look at Marx's involvement with back and forth on the French translation of Capital, he really wasn't that hot and bothered about micro level issues about word choices. He seemed to be fine, often with like multiple German words with subtly different shades of meaning being translated with the same French word. He did not seem to think that that's where the action was. Again, not a puzzle box. Sometimes we do need to do reconstructive work to figure out how the pieces of argument, how the different arguments he gives us conceptually fit together. But we're really not on like a Gnostic quest to find the secret hidden meaning underneath the text. Finally, volume one really does more or less stand on its own. Sometimes when there's genuine interpretive doubt, it could be useful to pull in something from one of the incomplete draft manuscripts that, Marx stitched together, for example, that Engels stitched together after Marx died to make volume two and then, volume three. I actually do that once in today's lecture, but generally speaking, like when we're at least, and I'm not saying don't read everything, you should read everything. Sometimes people get the idea that I'm saying you shouldn't read the Grundrisse. You should totally read the Grundrisse. Absolutely, you'll learn stuff. It's a good read. But I think that when you're deciding how much comparative weight to assign to what Marx says in different places, yeah, his masterpiece, lovingly prepared for publication, should always have more weight in sort of, whenever there's like a sort of apparent tension between that and something that says somewhere else, than the various things that he didn't think anybody was going to read, right? I think that's just kind of common sense, right? That like this is what we would apply to literally any writer, right? That the things that were actually published and they were in full control of, sort of back and forth for edits and all that stuff, right? That's what you should sort of give the most weight to in trying to decide, how to interpret their views. And then, as you go along the spectrum from there to what I hyperbolically describe in the slide as something Marx scrawled on a bar napkin 12 years before Capital, and half obliterated by his later use of that bar napkin to sop up spilled beer. As you go along that spectrum, you should kind of assign less and less weight to it. And of course, again, that is hyperbole, although I don't know, man, read Saito. The use of the soil fertility notebooks and stuff is sometimes not too far off from that. Okay. Ultimately, over the course of his life, Marx writes exactly 1,000-page doorstopper, working out his views at quite this level of rigor and with the intention of publishing it and actually getting to that point and revising it all the many times on the way to publication. And that's this one, right? So again, if you're trying to decide what Marx thinks, this is the main place that you should go. With all that said, There are a couple of points where knowing just a little bit of historical context of some of the debates Marx was intervening in does go a long way. And understanding what Marx is up to in part one on commodities and money is definitely one of those times. So let's get into that. Let's start right at the beginning of the first paragraph of chapter one. Marx writes, the wealth of societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails appears as an immense collection of commodities. The individual commodity appears as its elementary form. Our investigation, therefore, begins with the analysis of the commodity. So if you read, Michael Heinrich has a book called How to Read Marx's Capital, and where he does this like very detailed line by line breakdown of the early chapters, honestly, for my taste, sometimes with diminishing returns as it goes on. But if you read that book, he makes this claim that the first paragraph, the one that we just read, reveals that the commodity with which Marx begins his analysis is the commodity under capitalism. And it's easy to just kind of like nod as you're reading this, but it's really important to think about what Heinrich is claiming here and whether or not the textual evidence supports it, right? So Heinrich is claiming that the paragraph we just read reveals that in part one on money and commodities, Marx is only talking about commodities as they exist under capitalism. But what's the evidence for that? Let's see if Heinrich actually gives any, right? He says that exchange commodities and money exist in diverse modes of production. For example, in antiquities, mode of production based on slavery, and in medieval feudalism. However, Marx is not dealing with the commodity as something universal, something existing in various modes of production, but rather as the elementary form of wealth where the capitalist mode of production prevails. And I swear to God, that is as much argument as Heinrich gives us. That's it. If you keep reading past the screenshot, you are not going to find any other argument on that point. Right? So his argument is Marx says that in capitalist societies, right, in societies where the capitalist mode of production prevails, the elementary form of wealth is the commodity. That's the premise. And the conclusion is that therefore, Marx's analysis of commodities is only supposed to apply under capitalism. But I'm sorry, that conclusion just very obviously doesn't follow from the premise at all. All right? Later on in the book, Heinrich keeps reminding his readers that Marx's analysis of commodities is only supposed to apply to capital commodities in capitalism, but it's all just based on that one inference. To think about what's wrong with that inference, I think it might be useful to dip into the preface to the first edition, where Marx uses, oh no, you should absolutely be seeing a PowerPoint. When did that stop? That's not good. Hold on. All right. You see it again now? Okay. And just the PowerPoint, I'm not sharing anything else? Okay. Yeah. All right. So if you dip in to the preface to the first edition, Marx makes the same point that he does in that paragraph we just looked at, right? And since I guess the PowerPoint wasn't working, the PowerPoint screen sharing wasn't working, just to review, right? This is the paragraph I was talking about, right? He says, the wealth of societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails appears as an immense collection of commodities. The individual commodity appears as its elementary form. Our investigation therefore begins with the analysis of commodity, right? So Marx is saying, wealth in capitalist societies is made of commodities. Therefore, we're going to start our investigation of capitalism by talking about commodities. And Heinrich says, oh, that means that what Marx says about commodities in part one is only supposed to apply to commodities as they exist under capitalism, right? That's the inference that we're talking about right now. And again, I think that if you want to see why that doesn't really follow, I think it's interesting to put this passage next to another one where Marx is using essentially the same metaphor about commodities as the elementary form of wealth under capitalism. So in the preface to the first edition, there's this famous passage where he says, "Beginnings are always difficult in all sciences." Um, the understanding of the first chapter, especially the section that contains the analysis of commodities, will therefore present the greatest difficulty. I have popularized the passages concerning the substance of value and the magnitude of value as much as at all possible. And look, if right about now you're thinking maybe he could have stood to popularize those passages a little bit more than he did, I feel you. But the important part is what comes next. He says the value form, whose fully developed shape is the money form, is very simple and slight in content. Nevertheless, the human mind has sought in vain for more than 2,000 years to get to the bottom of it. Huh? If he's only talking about commodities under capitalism, how are we supposed to understand, spending 2,000 years trying to figure it out? Um, Especially because his explanation of that failure is not that there just was nothing to figure out until the last few hundred years. Um, Instead, he gives this epistemic explanation, this explanation that's purely in terms of our knowledge, our access to that knowledge. Um, he says, uh, right, the human mind has sought in vain for 2,000 years to figure out commodities, while on the other hand, there's been at least approximation to a successful analysis of forms which are much richer in content and more complex. Why? Because the complete body is easier to understand than its cells. Moreover, in the analysis of economic forms, neither microscopes nor chemical reagents are of assistance. The power of abstraction must replace both. But for bourgeois society, the commodity form of the product of labor and the value form of the commodity is the economic cell form. To the superficial observer, the analysis of these forms seems to turn on minutiae. It does, in fact, deal with minutiae, but so similarly does microscopic anatomy. And what I would suggest is that we take that analogy to molecular biology really seriously for a minute. Because I think putting that together with what Marx says in the opening paragraph of chapter 1 about commodities being the elementary form of wealth in capitalist societies is pretty revealing if we want to think carefully about what Marx is and is not saying about the connection between commodities and capitalism. If the first chapter of the treatise about cats was about biological cells, and the first chapter, sentence of that chapter, you say, cats are made of biological cells. So we're going to start by talking about that. You are not therefore suggesting that your general observations about how cells work only apply to cats. Now, granted, no one who is writing a book about cats would actually start with a chapter on cells. That'd be a deeply weird thing to do. So maybe here's a better metaphor. You've discovered a silicon-based life form on some distant planet. Maybe it keeps eating the astronauts that we send there. Let's say we manage to capture one of the silicon-based, alien monsters and bring it back to be studied. And, based on those experiments, you're writing up a manual about the aliens for future astronauts. You might actually devote the first chapter to talking about the properties of silicon in general. And the first sentence of that chapter might be, the aliens are made of silicon. Because even though your general observations about how silicon works don't only apply to those silicon-based alien monsters, an important difference between those monsters and every single one of the life forms we are more familiar with is that the aliens are the only ones made out of silicon. Yes, exactly. Similarly, capitalism is the only class system, the only system of exploitation that's made out of markets, or at least the only one so far. In principle, maybe we could imagine alternate forms of market-based class society, like John Romer has a famous example where he's imagining two islands where the economies were otherwise identical, but in one there are labor markets but no credit markets, and the other there are credit markets but no labor markets. And in both, the producers can't afford to buy their own means of production, but on on labor market island, it works like in any other capitalist society, whereas on credit market island, everything's made by self-employed producers who are buying the means of production on credit that's extended by rich people. So the surplus extraction would be through like, usury, right? Debt repayment. Um, and whether or not to classify what they've got going on Credit Market Island and the thought experiment as like a mutant form of capitalism or as an entirely different kind of economic system is an interesting question. We could argue about that. But maybe in principle, that maybe would be an alternate form of market-based class society. Or, of course, if you buy the techno-feudalism stuff, maybe you think we're already living in a different form of thoroughly market-based class society. I mean, I don't, right? But that is a position you could take. But whatever other systems could, in principle, exist in terms of the forms of society that actually have existed in real history, certainly by 1867, being made out of markets is a unique and interesting feature of the capitalist class structure. It's an absolutely fundamental difference between modern capitalism and, for example, medieval feudalism. Feudal society had markets. In fact, markets have existed around the world for thousands of years, but market relations weren't really building blocks of feudal society. They weren't, the foundation of relations between lords and serfs, for example, in the way that commodity exchange is the foundation of the relations between capitalists and workers. When you sell your working hours to the capitalist, that is a form of commodity exchange, and you're doing it so you can engage in a whole bunch of other acts of commodity exchange, like paying rent and paying for groceries. Capitalism is the first class society where commodities are the building blocks. So if we want to understand capitalism, how it's similar to previous systems, to be sure, but also how it's unique and different from previous forms of class society, we have to understand the building blocks themselves. And Marx thinks we need to do that before we can even think about how they can be put together to form something distinctively capitalist. It's a slow burn, right? In the reading you did for today, he didn't even get to capitalism until chapter 4. And he doesn't start to make the case that capitalism even is a class society, never mind what its unique features are, until chapter 6, right at the end of today's reading. But he's getting the elements in place in part 1 for the larger argument about capitalism as a class structure that he's basically going to start building in part 2 and going all the way to part 7 before he switches in part 8 to thinking about the historical origins of that class structure and how it might one day be overcome. When he says that lacking microscopes or chemical reagents, we're left to make do with the power of abstraction, what he means basically is that we can, build up models to explain, right, the incentive structures, the cause and effect structure of capitalist society by engaging in simplification and hypothetical thought experiments. We assume away certain complications to get at just the factors we want to look at a given time. Now, that is an approach that comes with some dangers. My mom is a retired community college math teacher, and growing up, I heard a lot of jokes about mathematicians. In one of them, a farmer brings a mathematician to help him figure out how to run his farm more efficiently. And after studying it for a little while, the mathematician presents his findings, and he starts by saying, assume a perfectly spherical cow. Right? Obviously not going to be that useful. The test of whatever you come up with through sort of simplifying hypothetical abstractions is whether once you reintroduce the real life complications, you reintroduce what you assumed away while building the model, it still tells you something interesting and important about the original thing. We'll have to wait and see. But just be aware that throughout Capital, one of Marx's go-to moves is to introduce hypothetical limiting assumptions. For example, throughout almost all of the non-historical parts of this book, he assumes for the sake of argument that all commodities, including labor power, are sold at their full value, which he knows perfectly well isn't true. In fact, he reminds us over and over again, several points throughout the book, that he knows it isn't true. But the reason he's assuming it for the sake of argument is that he wants to show that even if it were true, everything he wants to say about capitalism as a class society based on domination and exploitation would still go through. It would still make sense. We'll talk way more about that in just a few minutes. But the important point as far as part 1 is concerned is that one of the complications that Marx is assuming away in part one is capitalism itself. He makes this completely explicit in chapter 1, note 15, where he says, at this stage of our presentation, the category of wages does not exist at all. What he's doing in part one is unpacking what he often calls, when he's referring back to this in other things that he wrote, simple commodity circulation. And, if you go to, volume 2, right, there's a passage where he tells us that simple commodity circulation and the laws of simple commodity circulation, which are what he's giving you in part one of volume 1, in no way necessarily involve the circulation of capital, since simple commodity circulation can proceed quite well on the basis of non-capitalist production. So he tells us in chapter 1, footnote 15, and he tells us again when he's looking back on volume 1 and one of those volume 2 manuscripts, that what he's talking about in part 1 are features of market exchange so general that they could apply to non-capitalist markets as well as capitalist ones. That the very fact that society is divided into workers and capitalists does not exist at all at this stage of our presentation. So what are those features? Well, at the beginning of chapter 1, I see you. Let me just, I'm going to circle back to you in just a minute, okay? He tells us that commodities have both use values, which are roughly what they do for the person who possesses them, and exchange values, which are the specific power they have of being exchanged for other commodities. This there is nothing unique about, right? If you read Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations, or if you read Ricardo's book, which I do not have to use as a prop, if you, I think I've only looked at that on Kindle, but if you read both of those guys make the same distinction, right, early on about use value and exchange value. So again, use value is roughly what the commodity does for the person who possesses it, and exchange value is the specific power of being exchanged for other commodities. Then Marx tells you there's a third thing besides use value and exchange value, which is just plain old value, just value with no adjective. So to use one of Marx's favorite illustrations, if a yard of linen is worth such and such many pounds of coffee and such many ounces of gold, there must be some property of the linen and the coffee and the gold that they all have in common, but they have very different amounts of. And he works his way very quickly to the conclusion that this third thing must be that they're all products of human labor in general. His argument on that point is very quick, probably in part that because there is some degree of overlap on this point between him and the classical bourgeois economist that he's both building off of and criticizing. Adam Smith thought that in a rude and simple state of society where people were just bartering, the value of the products they were exchanging would just be a function of the labor it took to create them. Though Smith thought that in a modern market economy, it's more complicated, that, in that circumstance, part of the value of a commodity comes from labor and part of it comes from other factors of production. And then David Ricardo has a full-on labor theory of value even for modern capitalist economies. Marx's version is more sophisticated in some ways than Ricardo's, right? He, certainly, and I know some, Marxologists have minor heart attacks. I say this, that but even if you don't think that it's fundamentally different, right? At least Marx is being more careful about certain things, is adding on, caveats and anticipating certain objections and being more careful on certain points than Ricardo is. And there are even places, right, in here where, we'll look at one of them later, where he talks about Ricardo and Smith's views about value in a way that very much makes it seem like he himself doesn't exactly think there's a night and day difference. The reason I'm harping on this point is that I think it helps explain why, when Marx is arguing for his theory of value at the beginning of chapter 1, his argument moves so quickly. This is something David Harvey says in his companion to Marx's Capital that I think Harvey is totally right about. that Marx doesn't put much effort into arguing for labor theory of value because to a great extent it represented common ground between him and classical economists that he's criticizing. Um, Really, the only argument for thinking that the third thing must be universal human labor he gives is that all the different commodities um, that can have the same exchange value are so wildly heterogeneous and there are different properties that the third thing, the common property, by virtue of which, measuring it gives you the common exchange value, can't be any property having to do with the physical features of those commodities. It can't be anything that have to do with their specific use value. He says it can't be anything geometrical, physical, or chemical, or any other natural property. That must therefore be uh, absolutely general human nature, human labor in the abstract. And then he puts in his bells and whistles and says that the value of a commodity isn't a matter of how much labor it actually takes to produce in practice. So, if the producer was particularly bad at his job, the commodity would be more valuable, but rather the average socially necessary number of hours of labor, given the prevailing level of technology, standard work practices, etc. Once we've abstracted away, and what that means is a whole can of worms we are not going to get into today, but once we abstracted away from the differences between different, concrete labor processes, the weavers and the joiners. But of course, a contemporary bourgeois economist who's a marginalist about value would be able to accept Marx's premise and reject his conclusion. They would say, yeah, sure, I agree. The third thing can't be anything geometrical or chemical or, physical or natural. It's something psychological. It's consumer preferences. The value of a commodity is a function of how much people desire it and are thus willing to pay for it. And that's it. Now, Marx doesn't really argue, he sort of does for predecessors, but not really, right? He doesn't really argue against this view in Capital because he doesn't have a time machine. Sort of marginal revolution in economics came after, right, Capital, right? That the people at the time who were starting to move in that direction weren't really people who Marx was interacted with. But of course, as we're reading Marx, in the 21st century, this is something we have to think about. Before we think about it, though, and before we go to Evan's, contribution or question, I think we are well past the time where I should give you at least my take, so you can think about what you think about it, on what Marx is up to in part one and how it's supposed to relate to the argument on labor exploitation that Marx starts to build in part two. Why does Marx start this book at the simple commodity circulation level of abstraction, taking the most basic things about commodity exchange and just examining those before we even start to think about capitalism as a class society? This is a place where credit where credit's due, since this is a person I disagree with about many things, but I think that makes it more important to sort of give credit when I think like he convinced me of something, right? If you read William Clare Roberts' book, Marx's Inferno, then I think that's immensely helpful on figuring out what's going on in part one, even though, he and I do still have different readings of some of it at the end of the day. The real virtue of that book is that he does all this great deep dive research into factional debates between different kinds of 19th century radicals. And reading that a couple of years ago and thinking about part one really helped some of this to click into place for me. So basically, here's my grand unified theory of capital. Throughout this book, Marx is waging a two-front ideological war against, on the one hand, bourgeois economists who, bourgeois apologists who argue that capitalism isn't and can't be a system of domination and exploitation because, after all, its building blocks are consensual market exchanges. And on the other hand, bad critics of capitalism who think that the problem with capitalism is that it does trample the rules of fair market exchange. Perhaps because market exchanges are mediated through the money form, which tricks workers and other victims of capitalist processes into making unfair exchanges. This is the view that Marx associates, for example, with Proudhon. And he thinks this view misses the point about the respect in which capitalism is exploitative. So the opening chapters on the market building blocks, before he even looks at how those blocks can be assembled into a capitalist class structure, Marx is arguing at length that exchanging a particular useful commodity for money isn't fundamentally different. At least not in the way that the Proudhonians think it is, from exchanging it for any other particular useful commodity. And once that clicks into place, so much of what can feel the most obscure in the first three chapters actually starts to make sense. Like in my experience, when people start taking capital classes, or they join capital reading groups, or they just start trying to read it on their own for the first time, there are basically two places where they're likely to give up before they even get to the really good parts. One of them is chapter 3, lasts for a long time, oftentimes just unclear to people where Marx is going with it. But lots of people don't even get that far because they give up during chapter 1, section 3, when Marx is going through all the forms of value, with the yards of linen. And I think the reason people give up during 1.3 is that they just have no idea what point he's ultimately trying to make. They kind of see the sea of like nuances and distinctions, but like they don't really see what it's all supposed to add up to. All right. So when Marx is going through these 4 forms of value, right, A, B, C, and D, I think that the problem is often that if you're trying to read this cold in the 21st century, you don't have the context, right? That's what I was saying earlier about how sometimes just a little bit of historical context can go a long way. Starting in chapter 4, you need a lot less because the argument gets a lot more transparent, but it goes a long way in understanding the first 3 chapters. So what he's doing when he goes through those forms of value is that he's fighting that second front in his 2-front ideological war against the bad critics of capitalism, the ones who think that the exploitative thing about capitalism is that workers are being cheated in unfair market exchanges. They're not trading value for equal value, perhaps because they're being tricked by the money form. And Marx is saying, no, there's absolutely nothing special about the money form. That's not the problem. So in 1.3, remember, he starts out with what he calls the simple or isolated form of value equivalence between 2 commodities that can have the same exchange value. X amount of commodity A is worth Y amount of commodity B, like 20 yards of linen is worth 1 coat. And then we move from that to the total or expanded form of value, where one commodity is being, is worth as much as another commodity, and that commodity is worth worth such and such amount of the third commodity, and that commodity is worth such and such amount of the fourth commodity, and the chain of equivalences can just kind of go on indefinitely. And then we move from there to the general form of value, right? That's C, where one commodity is being sort of plucked out of the list and used to represent the values of the rest. Way easier to keep track that way. And finally, we have D, the money form, which is exactly like the general form, except that instead of yards of linen, we're using ounces of gold to represent the values of all the other commodities. And Marx's point is precisely that as we go from A to B to C to D, from the simpler accidental form of value to the total or expanded form, to the general form, to the money form, nothing fundamentally has changed. It's all just commodities being exchanged for other commodities. There's nothing special or magical about the money form. And he does call the money form the highest form of value a couple times, which might sound like it's in tension with what I just said. But then when you read chapters 2 and 3, that starts to fall into place too. In chapter 2 on exchange, for example, he basically argues that the wheels of commodity exchange are considerably greased if we elevate one commodity to the position of the universal equivalent. That everybody is going to accept in exchange for all the other commodities. We don't have to keep track of how many yards of linen 1 pound of coffee is worth and how many pounds of coffee 3 pounds of iron are worth, because we just elevate gold to the universal equivalent and measure all the rest in terms of gold. And in principle, he says in chapter 2, anything could be the universal equivalent. And he has some fun listing wacky things like cattle that various early societies used as the universal equivalent. but he thinks that silver and gold have properties that make them uniquely well suited to the task. He approvingly quotes a maxim about how silver and gold are not by their nature money, but money is by its nature silver and gold. The features he lists are things like not spoiling when you store them for years and being easy to break down into small bits and easy to recombine, right? Melt into larger bits, which are all features that silver and gold have that cows, for example, don't have. That helps explain why you don't get a lot of complex market societies with cattle-based currency. But it's kind of fun to note that all the features on his list that make silver and gold particularly good candidates for the universal equivalent would apply even more to numbers on an electronic record, which is essentially what 21st century fiat currency is. Doesn't go bad? Check. Easy to break down into small bits? Check. Easy to recombine into larger ones? Check. You want to have something be worth 1/1000th of a penny? No problem. Right? We can represent that. And since there's no underlying thing that we have to break down or melt back together, right? It's all very easy. And part of what he seems to mean by saying that the money form is the highest form of value is that the commodities complex societies tend to settle on as the money form tend to be commodities that at least approach having their only use value be their exchange value. Though he's scrupulous enough to note in chapter 2 that even in societies where gold is the money commodity, it's still used for some other purposes, like serving to fill in hollow teeth and forming the raw material for luxury articles, as in on the right of the slide, the famous golden toilet at Trump Tower. But the main thing that money does is just to facilitate the smooth and easy exchange of other commodities. So, for example, one of my favorite fun examples in this whole book, in chapter 3, Marx imagines a weaver who exchanges his yards of linen for some gold, and being a man of the old school, he uses the gold to buy a family Bible. When the Bible salesman, who Marx calls the Bible pusher, which is fun, gets the gold in exchange for his Bible, he uses it to buy brandy. And so Marx writes, the Bible pusher, who prefers a warming drink to cold sheets, had no intention of exchanging linen for his Bible. The weaver did not know that the wheat had been exchanged for his linen. B's commodity replaces that of A, but A and B do not materially exchange their commodities. It may in fact happen that A and B buy from each other, but a particular relationship of this kind is by no means the necessary result of the general conditions of the circulation of commodities. We see here, on the one hand, how the exchange of commodities breaks through all the individual and local limitations of the direct exchange of products and develops the metabolic process of human labor. On the other hand, there develops a whole network of social connections of natural origin, entirely beyond the control of now human agents. Only because the farmer has sold his wheat is the weaver able to sell his linen. Only because the weaver has sold his linen is our rational and temperate friend able to sell his Bible. And only because the latter already has the water of life, the water of everlasting life, is the distiller able to sell his French phrase meaning water of life. And so it goes on. By the way, every time I read these passages about the man of the old school and the rational and temperate Bible pusher, I think of the Peter Bogdanovich movie Paper Moon, where one of the main characters is in fact a Bible salesman who spends a lot of the proceeds on booze. If you've never seen it, it's really wonderful and you should check it out. One of my absolute favorites. But in any case, what Marx is describing here is the circuit that commodities travel between the form of particular useful commodities and the form of money. That circuit is CMC, commodities to money to commodities. This is the form of market interaction that most market agents have been engaged with for most of human history. It's what, for example, even a subsistence farmer who makes most of his own stuff might do if he takes some of the extra he made but doesn't need to the market to sell it to buy things he needs but can't make. When you're doing CMC, the goal is to go from having use values you don't need or that you need less to having use values that you do need or you need more. But when Marx finally starts talking about capitalism per se in chapter 4, the first thing he says about it is that the first thing he observes about capitalist economic behavior is that the capitalist is interested in a very different circuit of market exchange. When the capitalist buys factory equipment and pays workers wages and buys raw materials so he can make commodities, and then he sells those commodities for a profit, he's not doing CMC. He's doing MCM, money to commodities to money. And he very quickly points out that really what the capitalist is doing is MCM prime, money to commodities to more money, because if you get back exactly as much as you started with, what would be the point? If anything, if you were just going to do M to C the exact same amount of M you started with, the miser who just stuffs his money under the bed or stacks it up in the closet would have a more rational plan, because at least the miser isn't exposing his money to the vagaries of the market. But of course, the capitalist is the rational one, because he knows that investing the money in factory equipment and workers and raw materials that his means that his money can grow into more money in a way that it wouldn't on its own if it stayed, stacked up in the closet or stuffed under the bed. Marx says in chapter 4 that the capitalist and the miser are both engaged in the pursuit of maximum exchange value, but the capitalist is a rational miser, while the miser is the capitalist gone mad. And crucially, the capitalist is being driven not by a private mania, but by market incentives. This is a really crucial point. Capitalists, might often be bastards, but that's just because that's what impersonal market forces select for. The problem isn't the state of the capitalist soul. The more basic problem is the structural incentives, what Marx sometimes calls the coercive laws of competition. So at the top of the slide, Marx says that if the capitalist doesn't accumulate capital as efficiently as possible, if he doesn't act like capital personified and endowed with a will, he'll be outcompeted by somebody who is willing to act like that. And we should pause here on a really important question. What is the capital that the capitalist is the personification of? In other words, who exactly is the title character of this book? Capital. And this is a subtle point, because it seems to me that Marx sometimes uses that word in a slightly broader way, and he sometimes uses it in a slightly narrower way. What I'm primarily thinking of here is the passage in chapter 5, where he contrasts what he calls the primary form of capital, i.e. capital invested in labor power in order to produce commodities, which he says is the form in which capital determines the economic organization of modern society, with what he says he's entirely left out of consideration, which is the well-known and, so to speak, antediluvian forms of capital. Antediluvian meaning before the flood. So it's a poetic way of saying these things have been around, for thousands of years. It's very ancient, like merchant capital and usurer's capital. Then merchants in ancient Babylon. Right? Money lenders have been around for long enough for Jesus to, kick them out of the temple, and for a long time before that. And of course, there is, well, let me put it this way, right? I think there's a little bit of ambiguity, but my best read on this passage, and you guys can decide whether this makes sense to you, is that Marx sometimes uses the word capital in a broad sense, in which capital just means any instance of money being used in an MCM prime way, right? Any instance of money being spent on commodities with the intention of getting back more exchange value. But somewhere well north of 99% of the time when he uses the word capital, he's using the term in a much narrower way, which is what he's calling here the primary form of capital, which is to mean money that's being invested in labor power with the intention of making more money, spoiler for the end of chapter 6, through labor exploitation. And in fact, just as a preview of coming attractions, when we get to chapter 11, we'll find Marx saying employers don't even become capitalists until they employ enough workers that the owner doesn't have to do regular labor himself, and he can just devote himself wholly to the management and business sides of the operation. That until he gets to that point, he's just a small master, which Marx presents as a sort of transitional form, a sort of ambiguous half capitalist. Uh, there, it seems to me that Marx is really thinking of capital as a social force interacting with labor as a social force in a way that only makes sense if we have in mind the narrower reading, right? What he's calling the primary form, as like the sort of narrower and much more usual way that Marx sometimes used the word capital, although again, he does sometimes also use it in that broader way. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Chapter 5 is called The Contradictions in the General Formula, the general formula of capital being MCM prime. And the main contradiction Marx has in mind is the apparent contradiction, the seeming contradiction between, on the one hand, the assumption that every commodity is being traded at its full value, no one is being ripped off, nothing is being bought for more than it's worth, less than it's worth, or sold for more than it's worth. And the most notable, most obvious, most basic thing about the capitalist economic activity, which is that it's doing MCM prime, right? That the M prime is bigger than the M. How is it possible that turning M into C and then back into M can turn M into M prime? How, in other words, can it generate surplus value, extra M, unless something at some point is being bought at less than its value or sold at more than its value? Okay, that's obviously the question we want to talk about for the last chunk, but Evan has been waiting like patience on the mountaintop. So I do want to take the question or thought or contribution or whatever it is, and then we can finish up the last part of the lecture and which I know we got started late and etc. Right, but I'm hoping we still have a decent amount of time for discussion at the end of that. Evan?
Hey, thank you. So my question was actually a bit from the previous parts of the
Sure,
class,
that's okay.
but the question stick to my mind that there was a sentence, the power of abstraction must
Yeah.
replace both. So in this sense, should the power of abstraction, in the name of power of abstraction, we should separate the energy and the value of the laborer and
Mhm.
the value they create. So we treat them as
Mhm.
separate in the terms of this abstraction. Am I
Yeah,
understanding it quite right?
I think so. So let me just say it back to you, and you tell me if I've got the distinction you have in mind. Um, so so you talked about the energy or the power of the labor, right? So that's the um so this is the labor power, right? That's the capacity, right, of
Mhm.
the labor to do labor. And then you talked about the value they create with their labor. And you say, okay, well, as we're using the power of abstraction, we're using our you know, uh, we're using our ability to sort of like simplify things and kind of tease things apart in thought, right? As a substitute for microscopes and chemical reagents, that we can make a
Mhm.
distinction between those two things. So there's the capacity of the worker to work, and then there's the actual work they do. So far, so good.
Yes, actually, the time and energy and the personality of that laborer and the extracted value from that time and energy of that laborer, they must be separated. That was the premise of that sentence, right? Because I think it's a quite powerful one, and because the power of abstraction must replace. In that sense, abstraction means separation, right? We should understand it in its core,
Yeah, right. Okay, good.
right?
I think I've got you. Yeah. So I think that you kind of brought up two things, I think, right? But I think they're both right. Like I think Marx definitely does think both of these, right? I think they're both examples of what you're talking about, right? So the first thing you seem to be talking about is labor capacity versus labor, which is actually going to become hugely important when we get to chapter 6. And then the other thing that you're talking about when you say talk about like the individual personality of the laborer or the sort of like the actual like sort of particular work that the worker is doing versus sort of labor in the abstract is definitely the distinction he's trying to make uh, in chapter one, right? When he's giving the theory of value that he's saying,
Mm.
okay, the actual sort of I'm talking, I'm not talking about the particular work that's done in any particular case by a particular worker, because
Mm.
there could be all kinds of complications there. One person, is faster or slower than another, all that, right? I'm talking about this socially necessary average, and then the sort of most confusing part of the sentence, right? Is in the abstract. I'm talking about absolutely general human labor, right? So like it seems like, and I think this maybe is part of what you're getting at, right? Like it seems like what he's thinking about here is like we sort of abstract away everything that's specific to any particular labor process, right? And we say, okay, what's left over when we sort of boil away all of those complexities, right? To like what's common to all of them.
Yes and no.
Okay, okay, good. Yeah, tell me the no.
No, because the labor process is also not a defining factor of the laborer. Like the person is not the defining by labor at the core.
I see what you're saying.
I mean, Simone Weil was writing about this, so I'm kind of agreeing with her in that subject. Like, a person is not their value, a person's value is not their labor.
Right.
So, is that sentence means that also that like we have to abstract person from the labor because it's the most it's the most core case here, isn't it?
Yeah. Okay. I think I've got you. So I think um so okay, so I think maybe what you're really getting at here is about individual personality as opposed to abstracting away from that to just sort of talk about like economic categories. And if that's what you have in mind, I think it actually kind of nicely leads us back in to where we left off, right? Because um, this is a distinction that's going to come up, I think, right, in chapter
Mm.
five. So why don't, if it's okay with you, we're going to go. Let's go back into the chapter five part, and then when we sort of finished up the whole thing, you can sort
Yeah.
of loop back and be like, see if like, okay, does this speak
Um,
to the distinction you have in mind, or do you, where you try to get at something entirely different? Uh,
mhm.
so in in chapter five, right? So where we left off, he's talking about the contradictions in the general formula, and again, the primary contradiction he has in mind is the seeming contradiction between the assumption that all the commodities are being exchanged at their values, nobody's being ripped off, nobody's selling anything for more than what it's worth, or buying anything for less than what it's worth. Between that assumption and the singularly obvious fact about MCM, which is that it's MCM prime, that that you're making more money at the end of the process. Um, and of course, boosters of capitalism like to associate capitalist profit making with the idea that each side of a transaction can benefit in their own way, right? So you can have mutually beneficial transactions, which Marx thinks is in a certain sense true. He doesn't deny that, but as he points out several times in chapter five, that just doesn't work in terms of shedding any light on the source of capitalist profits. It's one thing to say in terms of use value that each side can benefit because they each end up with the use value they prefer. In fact, that's integral, the whole linen to Bible to brandy example from chapter three. But that has nothing to do with exchange value. Uh, and we can make Marx's point here concrete by imagining two characters. We will very creatively call them John and Jill. Um, and uh, we can say that at the beginning of the transactions between them, John starts out with $20 in his bank account and Jill starts out with $15 in hers. Here's the sum total of what then happens. John sells one of his possessions to Jill, and Jill sells one of her possessions to John. Nothing else happens, right? That's it. Okay. What are the possible results of this series of events? Maybe John pays exactly as much for Jill's commodity that Jill pays for John's commodity. It all evens out, right? The money is actually redundant. They could have just, done it as a quick barter. So at the end of the process, John still has $20, Jill still has $15. Or maybe John pays for Jill's commodity and then Jill pays for John's commodity. And maybe, in other words, John pays more for Jill's commodity than Jill pays for John's commodity. So John ends up with less than $20 and Jill ends up with more than $15. Maybe Jill pays for more for John's commodity than John pays for her commodity. So John ends up richer and Jill ends up poorer than they both started with. Those are all possible outcomes, right? Everybody has exactly the same amount they started with. John ends up with more, Jill ends up with more, right? None of those are outcomes that we would find confusing. But how about this as a possible outcome? John, after John sells one of his possessions to Jill, Jill sells one of her possessions to John. John now has $21 and Jill now has $16. Is that a possible outcome of this chain of events? Presumably not, right? If I told you that had happened, you'd be very confused. In fact, you'd be absolutely certain that something else had happened besides those two sales that explained how both of them ended up with more exchange value than they started with. And by the way, this argument doesn't depend in any way on any particular claim about the nature of value or, whether there is some sort of static value or marginals or any of that, right? It's just purely, just thinking about quantities of exchange value. And we can fill in details. We could say John sold Jill, a leather jacket that he doesn't like anymore and Jill always wanted. It's a little big on her, but, she likes it as a fashion choice. And Jill sold John a vinyl record that, she hadn't listened to in years. And, it's all mutually beneficial on the level of use values, right? They both end up with a use value they liked more than the one they started with. That's all fine. But that's not the confusing part. The confusing part is how it could possibly be mutually beneficial on the level of exchange value, right? Again, just an exchange and nothing else. Because thinking about stuff like the John and Jill example seems to just show that it can't. And that takes us back to where we started. Because if sales and purchases can't be mutually beneficial on the level of exchange value, then it looks very much like the only way for one party to get the better of a deal is if the other party gets the worse. And then the most memorable argument in the chapter is that even if we drop the first half of the contradiction, we drop the assumption that everything is being sold at its full value, that won't help. First, Marx considers the possibility that sellers as a category have a general advantage over buyers of a category, right? What he calls an inexplicable privilege that lets sellers in general sell more than the value of their goods. And of course, he points out that won't help because what they can do, what they gain when they're selling, right? When they're doing C to M prime, they'll lose in the next round of the MCM cycle when they turn around and become buyers, when they do M to C, right? What they've gained as sellers, they'll lose as buyers. And then he considers the opposite assumption, that it's the buyers that have the inexplicable privilege. That lets them buy things for less than what they're worth. And he concludes that won't work either for exactly the same reason, which is that the capitalist both buys and sells on his way from the initial M to the final M prime, right? So, again, if buyers have an inexplicable privilege, it'll just cancel out when they lose it when they become sellers. If sellers have an inexplicable privilege, they'll cancel out when they become buyers. So far, Marx is, and this is what I thought might be relevant to Evan's point, although I think it might be more subtle than this, but this is at least what I was thinking of at the end of that exchange. That Marx so far has only been considering individuals as representatives of general economic categories. In fact, if you go back to the preface, he says, I will only consider individuals here as representatives of general economic categories. But in his desperation to find a solution to this contradiction with the general formula, he's willing to drop that assumption. He says, okay, maybe this is the problem, that we've just been thinking of general economic categories like buyers and sellers, but maybe instead we should be thinking about particular individuals. Marx certainly doesn't deny that some capitalists can be better businessmen than other capitalists, can better master the art of the deal, buying cheap and selling dear. So when we zoom into the individual level, sure, like we could, drop the methodological commitment to only thinking in terms of general economic categories rather than thinking about particular individuals. At that point, we can at least make sense of how individual capitalists can get the better of other capitalists in business deals, and thus how individual capitalists can go from M to M prime. But Marx points out that this doesn't take us any closer to understanding how the entire stock of capital owned by the capitalist class as a whole can go from M to M prime, which is really what we're trying to explain. When all right, sorry. When we think about the absolute explosion of capitalist wealth in societies like the one that Marx lived in Victorian England, where the primary form of capital determined the economic organization of modern society and drove this dizzying growth. One capitalist getting the better of other capitalists in business deals might explain how how capitalist wealth can be redistributed within the capitalist class. But it does not explain where the capitalist class as a whole gets its wealth. This takes Marx to probably the most memorable line of the whole chapter, which is this. He says, the capitalist class of a given country, taken as a whole, cannot defraud itself. So however much we twist and turn, he concludes, the result remains the same. If equivalents are exchanged, no surplus value results. And if non-equivalents are exchanged, we still have no surplus value. And so what does explain the origins of surplus value, we finally learn in chapter 6, which on the sale and purchase of labor power, which was the first distinction I thought Evan was making. And the crucial insight here is that one that Marx credits in footnote 5 to Thomas Hobbes, which did not notice until several readings of this but it says, yeah, this is something that's plucked out of the Leviathan, where Hobbes says that the commodity that workers are selling in the labor markets isn't their labor exactly, but their labor power, their capacity to work for a given period of time. And this sets up an absolutely crucial distinction that you need if you want to get the mechanics of Marx's view of how all of this, of how labor exploitation works and how that fits in with the theory of value that you got way back at the beginning of chapter 1. So the idea is that the value of a day's labor power, right? In other words, the value of the commodity workers are selling, which is their capacity to work over the course of a day, is not at all the same thing as the amount of value that's created by the worker's labor over the course of that day. And I know that often sounds super confusing the first time you hear it. I'm sure different students have different levels of background with how much time they've spent with this book before this. But I promise it does make sense. Because look, labor power is a commodity, like any other commodity. Where does any commodity get its value? According to the value theory from chapter 1. Well, any commodity gets its value from the amount of socially necessary labor time that it takes to produce it. Okay, cool. So what's the amount of socially necessary labor time it takes to produce a day's labor power? Well, however much it takes to produce whatever bundle of commodities the worker needs to subsist from one day to the next. Okay, cool. How much is that? Well, Marx could make things easier for himself, right? I mean, this would actually, if anything, I think this would actually make the whole argument go through much more simply and obviously and quickly if he just said that the bundle of commodities that the worker needs to subsist from one day to another is just whatever he needs to not like drop dead before his next shift, right? Just minimally keep body and soul together. But Marx has a more sophisticated and I think more plausible view than that. He understands, and I think he's right about this, that there's no more and could no more be a single transhistorical standard for what counts as subsistence, of what level you have to be at in order to be keeping your head above abject poverty, applying in all times and all places, than there is a single standard of what counts as speaking correct English that would apply equally well in the era of Chaucer, in the era of Shakespeare, in the era of Charles Dickens, right? These things evolve. Marx says that there's a historical and moral element to it, meaning that what counts as subsistence in a given society is in part the result of technological progress, in part cultural norms, past victories in class struggle, whatever. All that stuff factors in. Which, by the way, I think is what everybody kind of thinks on reflection. You know, a certain kind of right-winger loves to say, oh, well, you're complaining about poverty, but what you call poor in America in the 21st century would have been considered rich and, you know, to your great-grandparents back in whatever other country, et cetera, right? Like, it's like, okay, sure, but that's not relevant, right? Like, that's not what anybody means by poverty, right? Everybody understands that this is an evolving historical standard. You know, the most dedicated pro-capitalist ideologue, right? The person whose copy of, you know, Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged looks like this copy of Capital, if they're born into, you know, a poor family and, you know, they're dedicated to using their pluck and talent and hard work to climbing through the class structure, becoming upwardly mobile and getting out of poverty. If you told that person, why are you talking about getting out of poverty? You're already not poor. Nobody in, you know, 19th century Ukraine would have considered this poverty. Like that person wouldn't be like, oh, never mind. I guess I've mission accomplished. I've already climbed out of poverty, right? Like again, I think we all understand that this is an evolving historical standard. But the crucial conceptual point here for Marx's purposes in context is that even when we factor in the historical and moral element, right? Like, you know, all the factors that can go into what counts as subsistence in a given time and place, the worker can still do more labor in the case of one day's labor than the amount of labor it takes to produce a bundle of commodities that gets them to that socially determined standard of subsistence, right? That's the key point. So what all of this adds up to is that labor power is a special commodity with this special kind of magical property of being able to produce more value than it itself is worth. And once you've got that piece in place, that finally solves the puzzle of how M can become M prime without anyone violating, you know, what he calls the law of exchange, right? That, you know, you're trading value for equal value. And this is a good time to remember why Marx is so keen to prove that surplus value extraction can happen even if everyone's following the law of exchange. And while we're at it, we could think just a little bit about how much of this does and doesn't logically and conceptually depend on the value theory from chapter 1, which I said we'd cover today, although obviously we'll also talk about it much more next week. First, remember what that value theory does and doesn't say. We keep saying that the value of a commodity is the average amount of socially necessary labor time in the abstract. It's a mouthful that it takes to produce it, which is fine. But how does this third thing, right, value, how does that relate to actual market price? The whole point of introducing the third thing back in chapter 1 was to explain exchange value ratios. But we also said that Marx is very, very clear on many occasions that he knows that once we've reintroduced the complexities and messiness of real world economies and stopped thinking in terms of, perfectly spherical cows, it's very, very often the case that commodities are not sold at their exact labor time values. In fact, if we go back to chapter 5, note 24, we find him being extremely careful about the scope of what he's claiming about how value and price interact. To be clear, the position he takes in this footnote is still Marx disagreeing with the consensus of academically trained economists in the year 2026. Again, he does not have a time machine to keep up to date with what economists are thinking 17 decades after the book is published. But the actual scope of the empirical claim he's making is relatively cautious and subtle. He talks about oscillations in market prices. He certainly knows about supply and demand, which he understands as, he conceptualizes those as like external pressures that are pushing and pulling market prices away from labor time values. But he says that they still orbit in the general vicinity of those values, that over time those oscillations cancel each other out, and labor time value still acts as a kind of long-term regulating mechanism for market prices. He writes that the average price is the guiding light of the merchant or the manufacturer in every undertaking of a lengthy nature. The manufacturer knows that if a long period of time is considered, commodities are sold neither over nor under, but at their average price. If, therefore, we are at all interested in disinterested thinking, we would formulate the problem of the formation of capital as follows. How can we account for the origin of capital on the assumption that prices are regulated by the average price, i.e. ultimately by the value of the commodities? I say ultimately because average prices do not directly coincide with the value of commodities, as Adam Smith, Ricardo, and others believe. So trying to pin down exactly what ultimately regulating average price means is tricky. But what I want to suggest today is that for Marx's immediate purposes in Volume 1, it truly does not matter. Because while he does, as we've just seen, subscribe to the empirical premise that average prices are ultimately regulated by labor time values, that isn't doing any work in his argument that surplus value arises from labor exploitation. Instead, his point is, again, to wage that two-front war against both the defenders and the bad critics of capitalism. The first for saying that there's no domination and exploitation to see here, because how could there be if these were all fair market transactions where everything's being traded at its value? And the second for saying that the problem with capitalism is that everything is being traded at its value, that everything is not being traded at its value, that people are being ripped off in unfair market transactions. And Marx's point in both cases is no, both of you guys are wrong. It would be a system of domination and exploitation. It would be a class society, like feudalism is a class society, although we'll see next week with its own, in some ways, even more dangerous features, even if everyone was scrupulously following the law of exchange, trading value for absolutely equal value. And it seems to me that if you reject the claim about the role of value and Marx's sense of value as a long-term regulatory mechanism for price, if you don't think that value in that sense is a sort of empirically useful concept, or maybe if you're just agnostic about this, right? Could be you're just not sure what to think. That could be that. I think that's a perfectly respectable attitude. I mean, there are, some very smart economists like Anwar Sheikh who are still fighting the good fight, right, on defending, a version of the chapter 1 value theory. So you just, whereas you have all these other Marxist economists who are like prepared to give it up. And look, you might just not be sure who's right. You might not be totally sure what to make of that technical economic debate. But I think either way, the core of Marx's point here can ultimately be translated out of those terms entirely. If you think a fair price for labor power in terms of like norms of market fairness is whatever it takes to keep the worker in what, by the standards of their time and place, would count as a decent living, And while, of course, contemporary bourgeois apologists, again, they tend to be marginalist, they would insist there's actually no such thing as a fair price, or else a fair price is just definitionally whatever both parties are willing to agree to. I do think that the intuitions of the overwhelming majority of normal people in the 21st century do still include the idea that there are such things as fair and unfair prices. And that it's possible for people to agree to an unfair price because they're desperate. And that a fair price is one that lets the worker make a decent living. So if you think all of that, right, then both halves of Marx's point still holds, right? That, like, certainly Marx's claim about how labor exploitation works can absolutely go through without any sort of premise about value. But then, of course, Marx's further point, which is, this labor exploitation, as I'm understanding it, can still happen even if everything, including labor power, is being sold at its full value. And that you do have to do a bit more translation for. But if you just say, yeah, even if you're being paid a fair price for your labor power by the norms of market fairness, you're getting and making a decent living, you can still be exploited in the Marxist sense. Even that, I think, goes through. That workers can still be paid that much and still, over the course of the day, make commodities that are sold for more than what it takes to keep them at that decent standard of living. And by the way, when we say commodities here, Marx is making no distinction whatsoever between goods and services, right? That he just means, whatever, they're making whatever, whether it's a meal or a cab ride, or a durable physical good, right? They're making whatever the capitalist then sells, and then their wages are paid out of part of the proceeds of that. So it's still the case that they're spending part of their day reproducing their wages and part of the day making profits for the capitalists. So surplus value can be produced with no violation of the laws of market fairness without anybody being ripped off. And this gets Marx almost all the way to his central conclusion in these first two parts, that exploitation can happen without any violation of the norms of market fairness. I say almost because exploitation isn't simply value going from one hand to the other, right? Parents aren't being exploited by small children, right? Whose needs, they pay for. Old age pensioners aren't exploiters of citizens who democratically agree to work to fund their pensions through taxation. Exploitation to Marx means the involuntary transfer of labor flows simply by virtue of the class power of the exploiters. And we could make that definition a lot more precise in various ways, but it's good enough for now. We still want to have at least like half an hour for discussion at the end of all this. And the last piece Marx needs is to show that capitalist exploitation would still happen, even if everything were being sold at its value, right? The last piece he needs for that is the involuntariness, the fact that this all emerges from structural domination. And this too, he gives us in chapter 6. And this too has absolutely nothing to do with any sort of premises about, the nature of value or how prices are formed or the relation between the two, right? You flat out do not need, I would maintain, any of that to buy Marx's crucial argument here when he writes, in order that the owner of money may find labor power in the market as a commodity, various conditions must first be fulfilled. In and for itself, the exchange of commodities implies no other relation of dependence than those which result from its own nature. On this assumption, labor power can also appear on the market as a commodity only if and insofar as its possessor, the individual whose labor power it is, offers it for sale or sells it as a commodity. In order that its possessor may sell it as a commodity, he must have it at his disposal. He must be the free proprietor of his own labor capacity, hence of his person. So what Marx is describing as this first condition is what Marxists often called the bourgeois revolution, which is the greatest expansion of human freedom in all of history, however much it might leave to be desired. And when I say the bourgeois revolution, I don't mean some specific dramatic manifestation like the French Revolution. I just mean the general historical shift played out in weird, uneven ways over the course of centuries to a kind of universal legal equality underlying market societies, where instead of having a different set of rights and duties, depending on whether you're born into the peasantry or the aristocracy or whatever, everyone is seen as a bearer of equal legal rights, owning themselves and able to make contracts with who they please. So that's condition one. Marx goes on describing the owner of this peculiar commodity, labor power, to say he and the he and the owner of money meet at the market and enter into relations with each other on a footing of equality as owners of commodities, with the sole difference that one is a buyer, the other is a seller. Both are equal, therefore, in the eyes of the law. And everything's proceeding on the basis of the gains of the bourgeois revolution, right? He says, for this relation to continue, the proprietor of labor power must always sell it for a limited period only, for if he were to sell it in a lump once and for all, he would be selling himself, converting himself from a free man into a slave, from an owner of a commodity into a commodity. He must constantly treat his labor power as his own property, his own commodity, and he can do this only by placing it at the disposal of the buyer, i.e. handing it over to the buyer for him to consume for a definite period of time, temporarily. In this way, he manages both to alienate his own labor power and to avoid renouncing his rights of ownership over it. So Marx is saying, if you're going to have a system where legal equals are meeting the market, with some of them being workers and selling their labor power and some capitalists buying it, and this is going to be a distinct set of production relations, unlike previous systems like feudalism and slavery, then labor power must be a commodity that the worker can both sell and keep possession of to sell in the future. And the only way for both of those things to happen is that the worker sells it, timepiece by, chunk of time, right? One unit of time at a time. So this is all but about condition one, but Marx is about to give condition two, which is where it gets interesting. It says the second essential condition, which allows the owner of money to find labor power in the market as a commodity, is this: that the possessor of labor power, instead of being able to sell commodities in which his labor is objectified, must rather be compelled to offer for sale a commodity, as a commodity, that very labor power which exists only in his living body. In other words, the worker has to not be in a position to go into business for himself in order for labor power to be on the market as a commodity for the capitalist to buy. In order that a man may be able to sell commodities other than his labor power, he must, of course, possess means of production, such as raw materials, instruments of labor, etc. No boots can be made without leather. He also requires means of subsistence. Nobody, not even a practitioner of German phrase that means music of the future, which a footnote, the Penguin edition helpfully tells us is a phrase that means something like castles in the air, right? Not even a practitioner of that can live on the products of the future or on use values whose production has not yet been completed. Just as on the day of his appearance on the world stage, man must still consume every day before and while he produces. If products are produced as commodities, they must be sold after they have been produced, and they can only satisfy the producer's needs after they have been sold. The time necessary for sale must be counted as well as the time of production. And now we get to one of the most remarkable lines of the whole book. He writes, for the transformation of money into capital, therefore, the owner of money must find the free worker available on the commodity market. And this worker must be free in the double sense that as a free individual, he can dispose of his labor power as his own commodity, and that, on the other hand, he has no other commodity for sale, i.e. he is rid of them, he is free of all the objects needed for the realization of his labor power. So proletarians are on the one hand legally free in ways that slaves and serfs are not, to move around and make contracts with any capitalist who will have them, but on the other hand, they're free from any other means of supporting themselves, meaning that this thing they're free to do, they also have no choice but to seek out. So if you think about Amazon warehouses, right, which is surely count as citadels of whatever phase of capitalism we're living in right now, These are sites of all sorts of in-your-face oppressiveness. Workers are subject to constant electronic surveillance to make sure Jeff Bezos is squeezing every possible drop of work out of the hours he has them for, to the point of monitoring how many steps they take to the bathroom and back and how much time people spend there. People race to make sure the surveillance devices don't catch them falling behind in their quotas. Literally backbreaking labor, right? The rate of back injuries, at least as the time I wrote a Jackman article about this a few years ago, is way higher than even the rest of the warehouse industry. But of course, as our libertarian friends love pointing out, no one has to be marched at gunpoint to the doors of the warehouse to do that work. In fact, the most potent tool in Amazon's union busting arsenal is the threat of the loss of that work. Right? Workers are kept in line precisely by the fear of not being able to sell their labor power because they don't own their own means of production. And so, as I said, they're forced by their circumstances to do this thing they're free to do. That's Marx's concept of double freedom. Later in the book, Marx is going to call this the mute compulsion of economic circumstances. And the point here is that it is a form of compulsion. So we have surplus extraction and it's compelled. So we have exploitation. And it's all totally compatible with scrupulous adherence to the norms of market fairness, which is why Marx thinks that anyone criticizing capitalism, like from the perspective of those norms, anyone criticizing capitalism for failing to live up to the ideal of market fairness is fundamentally barking up the wrong tree. If anything, those market ideals will have to, be very thoroughly trampled by a successful workers' movement if we're going to expropriate the means of production from capitalists and create a society of, genuine freedom and equality, right? Not just a fair day's wage for a fair day's work, which was the slogan of the reformists of the more moderate American Federation of Labor at the beginning of the 20th century, but the abolition of the wages system, which was the slogan of their radical rivals in the industrial workers of the world. That's Marx's point. Because the problem with capitalism is not that workers are being ripped off in unequal exchanges. It's that they're in circumstances where they have to sell themselves to capitalists in the first place. And, this is a line of thought that finally culminates in that just power chord in the last few paragraphs of chapter 6, where Marx, asks us to leave in company with the owner of the money and the owner of labor power, to leave this noisy sphere where everything takes place on the surface in a full view of everyone, and follow them into what he calls the hidden abode of production, on whose threshold, right, a la Dante's hell, there hangs the notice, no admittance except on business. Here we see not only how the capitalist produces, but how capital is itself produced. The secret of profit-making may be at last laid bare. The sphere of circulation or commodity exchange, within whose boundaries the sale and purchase of labor power goes on, is in fact the very Eden of the rights of man. It is the exclusive realm of freedom, equality, property, and Bentham. Or at least that's how things appear when we're just examining the level of circulation, right? These horizontal relations of market exchange that the bourgeois apologist wants to focus on, right? Looks like all very cozy consensual contracts between free persons. But when we leave that sphere of exchange, when we go down into that hidden abode of production, to those vertical production relations between workers and capitalists, then, in other words, when we leave the sphere of simple circulation of the exchange of commodities, which provides the free trader vulgaris with all his views, his concepts, and the standard by which he judges the society of capital and wage labor, he who was previously the money owner now strides out in front as a capitalist. The possessor of labor power follows as his worker. The one smirks self-importantly and is intent on business. The other is timid and holds back, like someone who has brought his own hide to market and has nothing else to expect but a tanning. And that brings us to the end of part 2, which is how far I asked you guys to read for today. And on that, let's go to half an hour of discussion, right? And I guess, as I said earlier, we were kind of asked to save introductions for the second session in any case, but also in this, oh my God, it's such a good line. on this in this last half hour, let's definitely talk about, right, the lecture, but let's also talk about kind of how we want to proceed, right, in the coming sessions, right? If what kind of like student presentations we might, for example, do for the sessions 2 through 4 of the seminar, or maybe if you want to kind of think about it between now and next time, we can kind of decide that next week, and next week we can do roughly what we're doing this week, but like with certainly a much shorter lecture and more time for discussion. And then maybe in the last 2 weeks we can do a lot of student presentations. I'm relatively flexible, right, for what people kind of think they would benefit from in that regard. But enough from me. I'm gonna shut up. Let's go to discussion. Yeah, Zachary.
I guess maybe this is more of a question.
Sure.
I have to like slow this down a little bit, but the term socially necessary labor time, um, where does this subsistence, where are we connecting that with subsistence in the text? Because I understood it very differently because it first appears super early, like
Sure.
on page 129
Yep.
in the text. But where does it turn? It goes from the way I'm understanding it is the socially necessary labor time he's discussing is the amount of labor required to simply produce the amount of commodities in a particular time frame, right? And that's why when you said earlier, it doesn't really matter what that number is because it's constantly changing. It's prepared for us as a tautology effectively. It's a but I don't see the connection to subsistence yet.
Sure. Yeah, well, there isn't one yet, definitely on page 129, right? So page 129, right? We're in the beginning of chapter one. We're on the commodity. And remember in chapter one, right, this is, you go ahead to page 135, right? That's where we get footnote 15 that says, at this stage of our presentation, the category of wages does not exist at all, right? So, like, in other words, the context. So when he brings up value is socially, necessary. Like he first introduces the notion that like value is socially necessary labor time in chapter one. He's not talking about subsistence, right? That connection comes much later, right? Because again, as in that footnote 15, we're not thinking about wage labor at all right now, right? We're abstracting away from the fact that we're even talking about a society of workers and capitalists, right? So we're not, to use that, I don't know if it's helpful or not, but to use that spatial metaphor from the end of the lecture, right? We're like the sort of vertical relations between workers and capitalists like aren't introduced until chapter 6, right? In chapter 1, we're strictly talking about horizontal relations between like, presumably independent producers, right, buying and selling to each other, right? So subsistence isn't going to be relevant here, but there is a connection between the two, and this is let me take another run at that, right? So in chapter one, he's when the line you were talking about on page 129, right? Marx is thinking about, okay, how does any commodity get its value, right? Like, what's the value of a yard of linen? What's the value of an ounce of gold? What's the value of a pound of coffee, right? What's the value of any of it? Um, and in particular, how is it that these very heterogeneous commodities can all have the same value? That X number of yards of linen can be worth Y pounds of coffee, can be worth Z ounces of gold. And his answer is I'm skipping a couple of bells and whistles just so I don't have to say the whole thing every time, right? But like, is that his answer is, well, the value of each commodity is the amount of socially necessary labor time it takes to produce it. Oh yeah, how does subsistence tie into all this, right? Because it doesn't until we get to chapter 6, right? So in chapter 6, he starts talking about the fact that, oh, in capitalist societies, labor power is itself a commodity. I mean, that's what, makes it capitalist. Um, and so, okay, what's the value of labor power? Well, given what we said in chapter 1, the value of any commodity is the amount of socially necessary labor time it takes to produce it. The value of labor power must be oh, cool. Sorry, just looking at the comment from the newsletter. But okay, all right. Sorry. So given that the value of any commodity is the amount of socially necessary labor time it takes to produce it, the value of labor power must be the amount of socially necessary labor time it takes to produce labor power. But then think, okay, well, what's that? I mean, that actually sounds like kind of a funny way to talk, right? I mean, it's not like, the worker's capacity to produce, the worker's capacity to work to do a day's labor is not like something that was like produced by previous workers, right? Like in like a factory somewhere, right? So the way that Marx makes sense of this, right, says, okay, well, if the value of every commodity is the socially necessary labor time it takes to produce it, the value of labor power is the socially necessary labor time it takes to produce that, is to say the amount of socially necessary labor time it takes to produce labor power just resolves into the amount of socially necessary labor time it takes to produce the bundle of commodities that the worker needs to subsist from one day to the next, right? So this is my language a little bit, right? But I'm trying to describe what Marx is saying, right? So then, but then when he's saying, okay, well, what's the, when we talk about, the worker subsisting from one day to the next, what do we mean by subsistence, right? Do we just mean that the worker isn't going to like starve to death before his next shift, right? Or what do we mean, right? And that's where he has the line that I was trying to parse about the historical and moral element.
Yeah. That all makes sense. I guess what I'm seeing though, it seems that he's opening up when he starts
Yeah,
right before he starts talking about the idea that prices will change in a market. Like there's sort of it's an organic quality of not markets even yet, we're not even there yet, but he seems to be opening up the conceptual space for like market arbitrage. And even if we allow or if we not allow, if we sort of if we go at
sure.
the if we say that like the socially necessary labor power required for the subsistence of the laborers, is that not still part of all the socially necessary labor for, yes, their labor, the subsistence of those laborers, but also all the shit they made on a Tuesday, such that it would have a different value on Thursday, and we would be able to make profit in that arbitrage. So,
I see. I
and I
think,
think with the John and Jill example
yeah,
too, I
good.
think
Good. Yep.
let's bring it back. So I think
Sure. Yeah,
what
yeah.
what we get in this again, the socially necessary labor power or socially necessary labor required, the average socially necessary labor required in a day of production of all commodities is going to be it's going to vary from day to day. So let's take John and Jill and put them in
Yep.
an economy. And so let's say Jill sells something to John for $5, and
Yeah.
they're not just isolated, but he holds on to
Yeah.
it for a week. And the thing
Yeah.
that he sold him goes up in value, so he sells it. Now he's got that's where the extra dollar enters into the equation for him. And then he sells her something and she holds it, right? And what they're doing in that sort of they're deferring sort of
Yeah.
the value is never just instantaneous. Value always takes there's always duration connected with value. And I think what we get with that socially necessary labor in that for the first introduction of it allows for that triage over time for the arbitrage in a market.
Yeah, it definitely does, right? So I think, okay, so again, assuming here that like just to keep track of what we're talking about, right? That like assuming here that right this second what we're talking about is how all this works, like kind of internally to Marxist concepts, right? That like we could of course also talk about how it works on other views of value and all that, right? But like making that first assumption, then it certainly is going to be the case that the value of commodities can change after they're produced, right? That they because if nothing else, right? I mean, it could be that I mean, more often the value is gonna go down right after it's produced, because like the most sort of obvious reason for the labor time value to change would be that like there's some innovation that's introduced that makes it that like allows you to produce more of the thing in the same amount of time. But whatever. I mean, there could be just sort of like there could certainly be scenarios where it's the other way around, right? I mean that there's I don't know, like you have all of the that your country is being bombed, and like the better factories, like you don't have the equipment for them anymore, so now it actually takes way longer, right, to make the thing, right, so that they now the things after you've held on to them, right, like actually have a greater socially necessary labor time value, right, like that's certainly can happen, right, so I think that Marx would have to acknowledge that if there happen to be favorable changes in value, that under those circumstances, like, if you just like, if you buy at time one and sell at time two, then you could still pocket a profit, right? Without any violation of the law of exchange, right? Without anybody like, buying anything for less than its value or selling it for more than its value because the value itself has changed, right? So I think Marx would have to admit that. I think that, in fact, uh, later on in the book, when he's talking about you know, like actually, yeah, sorry, I guess not next week, but the week after that, right? We get to the chapters on relative surplus value production. He's talking about all the ways that production can be, like, the production process can be revolutionized. So you can like make things more quickly, and he does say pretty explicitly, right, that's like, yeah, the whole sort of, even though of course when the change becomes generalized, then the actual like average social value of the commodities changes, but like you know the whole incentive of the capitalists to make these changes is that they can like get ahead of that curve, right? They can have the temporary advantage of being able to to make things more quickly than like what their general value is. They can sell it at the general value before the general value catches up. So yeah, I think Marx would totally, sorry, this is me thinking out loud a little bit and trying not to meander, but I think that Marx would definitely have to acknowledge that what you're saying is real, right? That is a thing that would definitely happen, even if he's right about 100% of this, right? But I think he would also maintain that can't be that's sort of not explanatory of like the bulk of the phenomena, right? Like the sort of
Yeah.
main reason why capitalists make profits isn't that you happen to get favorable changes in like the labor time value of products, like in between, like making and selling.
Well, I guess to not maybe I wasn't super clear. I think he is saying that, right? I think
Okay.
he's not
Okay.
just he has to admit. I think he's saying that
Yeah.
because of we're getting sort of like layers of
Yeah.
how to
Yeah.
how to go MC M prime, whatever, like how to grow your money. We're getting layers, right? We've got the market arbitrage piece, which is the organic bit, and then we've got, of course, the capitalists as like
Sure.
a building on that. I don't know. Maybe
Yeah.
that's not the right way to think about it. I don't know.
Okay. Now that I think that makes sense. So, is there Um, yeah, no, I mean, again, he definitely is saying that, right? I mean, again, I just think I don't think we're disagreeing, but I just think for clarity, right? I mean, the thing that like the sort of key point for his argument here is that he thinks that like that can't explain like the sort of existence of that kind of arbitrage, right, only goes so far, right? Like in explaining, in explaining profits, right? Especially because, again, if anything, the more usual reason, right, that labor time values change is going to be disadvantaged, is going to disadvantage people who made it in the past.
Sure.
Yeah, cool. Other questions, thoughts? I don't know if um, Evan. By the way, please tell me if I'm mispronouncing your name, but they have but like I don't know if you wanted to go back to what you were raising earlier, or if anybody else had any thoughts or questions here.
That's the point. I think it's clear for me right now.
Okay,
But thank you for considering.
sure. Let's see. Any other people? And while we're also thinking about that, and people are thinking about if they have any other sort of questions, thoughts, devastating objections, wrinkles, right? To bring to any of this. Also, it would be good, I think, to maybe start thinking a little bit about format things for the later sessions, right? What people think about the idea of student presentations, for example. I see in the chat that of course we could do those live, or people could also upload recorded presentations. Yeah, I mean, I guess that's just a technical thing, but like, I mean, I guess the more basic question, right, is whether people want to do presentations, student presentations, and if so, like what those might look like, right? I mean, I have some ideas about what those could potentially look like, but I'm also want to hear what all of you think. Aga?
Sorry, I kind of was in the middle of a thought when you were saying this, so it's not a direct
No worries.
answer to what you
Yeah, it's okay. It's
just
okay.
asked.
It's okay.
So this is a question, a general question, relating to what you said at the beginning, which that you that there are many interpretations of the capital, which we obviously know,
Sure.
but and that you've brought forward your own interpretations,
Sure.
which might find like lots of disagreement. We might find disagreements with, and
Sure.
because I'm not super fluent in that theory, so I wanted to ask if there's like
Sure.
special important disagreements with the way you've presented this theory that we should kind of pay attention to and have a look at if we wanted to.
Totally, yeah. Yeah, I could also give, I think there's I know I've been given all this information. I just need to remember it or like find it. But like I also for the course like workspace or whatever, like I can also like upload some of this there. They that could like maybe do like a sort of optional supplemental reading list if people wanted to kind of take a look at some of the other readings that are out there that might be different from this in interesting ways, right? So I guess so just off the top of my head, right? So I mentioned the Michael Heinrich book, How to Read Marx's Capital, which is this like very close sort of line by line reading of like the early chapters. And I sort of went over a little bit like one thing that one place where I definitely diverge from Heinrich. This is not a deep cut, it's a pretty popular book, but a book that I got a lot out of and I found really interesting, even though I disagree on some points, right, is Soren Mao, which every time I say that name, it sounds a little funny because there's a much more famous Marxist with a last name that's pronounced that way, right? But Soren Mao has a book that's called Mute Compulsion, which is I think he's like a fairly clear writer, and I think certainly some of what I was saying about part one, I think he definitely has a different a different take on, right? That you see when you read that book, and sort of what the early chapters are doing there, and but again, like I think is very, even though again I think different tradition in some ways, I think is sort of much more influenced by certain kinds of continental philosophy, and is talking about Foucault and stuff like that. But like I think it's still very like accessible, right? Like and worth and worth engaging with. There's also a book called so yeah, I actually mentioned this one like for like a second, right, in the lecture, but there's a book is not right behind me, so I cannot use it as a prop, but it's the Marx's Inferno, the Political Theory of Capital by William Clare Roberts, which again I think definitely influenced me at least a little bit on some of the reading of part one, even though, right, he might not necessarily want to take credit for that, because I think where I ultimately go, right, might still be different enough, right, from what he's saying. But I found him interesting on that stuff, and also like, oh God, when we get to next week, right? So they have because we're parts. No, sorry, week after next. But they have but in the third session, when we get to that production of relative surplus value part of the book, so just there's a chapter in there about like automation, like factory machinery, that he I'll probably talk about some of the disagreements there, because Roberts, I think, interprets Marx in a way as like sort of thinking that the machinery itself is a problem, in a way that like I think is just like kind of baffling, right? Like if you read that chapter, it seems like Marx is very obviously not saying that, right? Like that that he thinks that the like it seems like he thinks the technology itself is neutral, and it's just a question of how like how society is organized to use it, right? So I think that's like a big interesting disagreement coming up. So yeah, I think those three examples are the first one that come to mind, right? So there's the Soren Mao book, the William Clare Roberts book, and the Michael Heinrich.
Thank you so much. And to answer your question somewhat about the
Yeah.
mode in which we would like to.
Yes. Good. Yep.
I cannot say I'm speak for everyone, but
Sure,
I
of course.
personally quite enjoy where there is like a distribution of presentations across
Yep.
all sessions, because it feels like you really kind of dip into things in a deeper level, but I don't know what everyone thinks about that.
Oh, let's find out. What do other people think about that? And if we did do that, right? I mean, the other question is like kind of how exactly we want to do that, right? So like one potential way of doing it, right? I mean, depending on like obviously we kind of have to figure out like what the total number of students who'd be doing it is, and then sort of decide it based on that, right? But one potential way of doing it is, okay, so the sort of overall approach of the class is to take these very uh is to sort of do this like kind of big overview, right, of these chunks of the book, but like maybe for the student presentations, for like having a kind of like short and focused sort of presentation, people could like pick out individual chapters, right? And talk about those, if that made sense. Or alternately, we could do it thematically, right? So I mean, that's a little bit harder to figure out in advance, but the presentations might be more interesting, right? So in other words, like we could have, you know, like obviously people would have to like do the relevant reading before they decided what they wanted to do, but like people could sort of pick out like particular topics that interested them in the sort of like over the course of multiple chapters, whatever, and do presentations on those, or there could be like a third way of doing this that I'm not thinking of right away, but I'd like to, I'm open to hearing it. I don't know. Any thoughts? Oh, Zach?
Would you be open to maybe a bit of a mix? And one thought I had was like, we are moving very quickly. Obviously, that's the point
Yeah,
here.
yeah,
But
yeah.
like to almost do a look back on a previous session, like I feel like
Ooh,
there's like a deeper dive into what the socially necessary labor time. I realized I was kind of clumsy with that, but like I would like to explore that a little bit deeper and
sure. Yep.
and also just like sort of the ontology of money in this previous section. I know that's sort of a look back. Maybe presentations come at the start of the next session and it looks back to a previous session.
I like that. I think that could work totally. Uh, Colin?
Yeah, thanks, Ben, for the class. But it's just something that just occurred
Sure.
me right now.
Yeah.
We don't have any time. Did we skip the whole fetishism of the commodity section?
Yeah. We did. I thought about that. Like, yeah, there was like one passing mention at the beginning. But that's but yeah, this is but like I kind of realized last night when I'd finished putting together my notes that it's like, okay, this is going to be a little bit crazy because even though, you know, I I disagree, right? But like I think that like a lot of people, right, this whole sort of the like tradition of like Marxology going back to Rubin, right? We'll say like those sort of few pages in commodity fetishism are like sort of like the key to the whole thing, right? And so even though ultimately I don't, my own view is that they're not, right? I mean, I think that that's Marx sort of setting up certain things that he's going to do in part two and afterwards. But it's also, it's but like I don't, it's, I mean, look, I think if he'd meant to write a book about commodity fetishism, he wouldn't have spent 2 pages on that and 980 pages on other stuff, right? But I think that I mean, I don't, so I think, I mean, like my own sort of, take on that for what it's worth, right, is that would be, that it's like, okay, like why is Marx talking about commodity fetishism there, right? What's the sort of relation, right, between that at the end of chapter one and what you get, later on in, part two and onwards, right, about, what he's talking about, capitalism as a class society. And it seems to me that like what he's setting up in that section is roughly what you get at the end of chapter six, right? That like if you're just sort of looking at the sphere of exchange, right? That's where all of your concepts, right, are coming from. This all seems very this all seems like very cozy and consensual, right? Like but then like you go down into the hidden abode of production, and things look entirely different, right? So I think that there's a sort of general conceptual point at the end of chapter one, which is that that it's that okay, the sort of nature of monetary exchange, right, means that it's sort of easy to, it like makes it very easy to think about what's going on, right, in the economy as a question of sort of relationships between like commodities themselves, right? Like he sort of he ends chapter one with the thing about commodity fetishism, and he starts chapter two with kind of a commodity fetishism joke where he says, like, since sadly, the commodities can't take themselves to market, right, to exchange themselves, they rely on us as their guardians, to do it, right, so there's this sort of way that there's this kind of social illusion that that, market relations can, like sort of, we don't see them as relations between people, right? We see them as relationships between the things, right? Between the sort of concrete commodities and the money and all of that stuff. And I think that again, I think like much of what's going on in chapters 1 through 3, I think one of the reasons why people often find those chapters more difficult than what comes afterwards, right, is because even though as you're reading it, it could be kind of like, oh, good line, interesting point, good line, right? Like it's still often very unclear like how it fits into the larger argument of the book, right? Like where is he going with all this, right? And so, my my take at least would be that like where he's going with that, right, is that's like the reason why it's significant that there's this sort of general danger kind of built into market exchange, right? That what are really, relations between human beings sort of take this form of appearance of relations, between things, right? Between the commodities themselves, right? Like why that's relevant is like to what goes on later in the book is basically what you find out at the end of part 2, right? That, about the like the sort of difference between, like if you're just looking at the relations between workers and capitalists as a market exchange, it can seem like the very end of the rights of man. And then like, but then like you sort of look at the underlying relationships between the human beings, that like actually exist in practice because of that, right? And then like suddenly it looks like exploitation of domination, right? So that's basically how I would read like what's going on in the commodity exchange section. And yeah, this did sort of briefly guiltily occur to me last night that like I was like, okay, this is already going to be like an hour and a half of lecture out of a 2.5 hour class, right? I cannot add anything new to this. I need to be cutting things, not adding, right? But yeah, that is. But I think you're still ultimately right? That's like a certainly like it's both interesting enough in itself and it's like important enough in enough readings of this book that like it is a bit crazy not to talk about it, right? This is the thing, this is kind of the danger of doing the like two parts at a time. And I think also frankly I think this could go with Zach's point, the suggestion from earlier, right? I mean that like if we wanted to do the student presentations as backward looking, right? Like so like we could like start out the new class, right? Like with people doing presentations on individual points that came up in part 1, right? I think this would be perfect for that, right? I mean like somebody could do a presentation on commodity fetishism, and they could talk about like some of the sort of like other readings where like commodity fetishism sort of plays a much bigger role in the argument than kind of what I just kind of gestured at, right, very briefly just now, right? I think that'd be a fantastic one for that.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, no, the conceptual connection
Yeah.
between the commodity fetishism and the end of part 2, like because of the issue of the opacity and the concealment and how this gets concealed in the sphere of exchange. Yeah. Yeah. And I remember, I think I once saw someone saying that apparently Marx wrote this section
Yeah.
afterwards and then he put it there. I'm not sure. Yeah, it's
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I guess we could. Yeah, I'm actually not sure off the top of my head. I know that I know that as the editions go by, right? So this is like what the Penguin edition, that's the one I suggested, translates is the fourth German edition of Capital, right? Which is the last one where you could at least have like Ingalls, right? Directly editing it. But I know so during Marx's lifetime, there are two German editions, and then there's the French edition. And I know that so if you read the Princeton translation of Capital, that's translated the second German edition, sort of on the grounds that that's the last one that like Marx could like directly like sign off on everything for. Although again, Marx is also very, very involved in the French edition, and there's like a bunch of changes that he made for the French edition that he asks Engels to plug in, right, to sort of later German ones. But yeah, I think maybe. So I know that in between the first and second German edition, Marx is like expanding, right? The first, so like the first three chapters in our edition are just one chapter, right? In the first German edition. And I know that like it's not just like a question of like where to put the chapter breaks, right? Like I know that he's also putting in new stuff, right? So yeah, that's interesting. And again, something if somebody did a presentation about this, they could they could fill us in on the details of that. That'd be great.
Thanks.
All right. I know we are just a little bit over time, but does anybody have any other sort of thoughts, questions, either like kind of substantively about what we talked about today, or sort of procedurally about how to go forward with student presentations and all that stuff? Okay. If people want to do the sort of, if people want to do the Zach option, which I really like, I think that might be the sort of easiest way of I think both the easiest and most interesting way, right, of doing student presentations, because I think that would both, it's easiest because like people would be in a good position to know the week before, right, what they want to do the presentation about, right? Like they're not just like and then it's also then and then also it's I think maybe the most interesting, right? Because like instead of just like being like assigning people a chapter to talk about or something like that, right? Like they're sort of in a good position to know what they find interesting enough that they want to go back to it and dig into it. So I really like that idea. So what we would need to do if we're going to do that idea, maybe even starting next Friday, right, is we'd have to first figure out like just how many people were up for doing this, which would be pretty relevant to like how much time we want to allot for each of them and all that. And then we would need to start doing some sort of like sign up sheet, right? For people to be like, hey, I want to do at the beginning of week 2, I want to do a presentation on commodity fetishism, or socially necessary labor time, or whatever it is. So what is and actually maybe if our host could weigh in here real quick before we go, what is the easiest way to coordinate among everybody to do this? What do we think?
Okay, so I think what we can do is as soon as we finish this session, we
Yep.
can create a sign-up sheet, and then we can send to the students via email. They can write their topics, they can write when they want to present, and if they want to do presentations in group too, they could do it as well, if it's up to you. But yeah, we can do it like that. We can do it like that. But it would be easier if we were to stipulate a limit of people that can present in a single day, like 15 minutes presentations or something like that, based on the amount of material you have to present.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Yeah. So I think that just off the top of my head, I think that maybe, yeah, if we did, I mean, assuming the presentations were no more than 15 minutes each, I think we could maybe like fit, I mean, or maybe like 10 minutes for the presentation itself and 5 minutes for like people to talk about it. Is that
We
too tight? What do we think?
Well, actually, 5 to 10 minutes, even though it doesn't seem much, when there is multiple people presenting, it just makes sense because we don't have much time. Because obviously, after each presentation, people would get into discussion and all of that stuff. So,
Okay, that makes sense. Okay, so yeah, let's do like 5 to 10 minutes for the actual presentation, and then we can kind of like set aside a few minutes each for each one to discuss in between, and that way we can't. I mean, we're still not gonna be able to fit in that many, but like I think we could do like maybe 3 or 4 right at the beginning of each class, and then we can do the sort of new lecture, and even keeping that much shorter than today. I think the combination of those two still leaves like about as much time as we had today for discussion. So do we want to try that for next week?
It works for me.
Okay. Okay, let's do that. So we'll do a sign up sheet. So we'll say maybe even to keep it on the safe side, like we can try expanding the number of presentations in the third and fourth sessions, but maybe just to make sure we don't run out of time, we could just do like 3 at the beginning of next time, right? So and then if there are more than 3 people or more than 3 groups of people, if people want to do it, together, that's fine with me too, right? Like so if there are more than 3 people who are really eager to present about stuff from this week, and so we don't have time next week, like the presentations don't necessarily have to be about the immediate like stuff that's taken from the immediate week before, right? We can keep doing stuff from the first session, and like the third session or whatever. Does all this make sense to everybody? Okay, sounds good. See you guys next week.
Thank you.
Thanks.